legal reform and development policy. I'm Hillary Amster. I'm the one of the international law fellows here at ASIL. I regret to inform you that one of our panelists, Tara Lawson-River, has a family emergency and can't be with us today. For those of you unfamiliar with the society, we're a 107-year-old educational institution, and our mission is to foster the study of international law through educational events like today's. Just have on your radar, tomorrow we have another CLE event. It's Customary International Law, What is its role in the U.S. legal system, with Curtis Bradley, Bradley Clark, and Carlos Vasquez. And that'll be here tomorrow from 12 to 1. We're also in full gear preparing for our annual meeting, which is just around the corner from April 3rd to 6th. The theme this year is International Law in a Multipolar World. And you can check out our program, which is on the website, and we hope you can join us for what looks like it's going to be a very promising lineup of speakers and coverage of key international legal issues. The Society would like to thank our panelists and give special thanks to the Washington Foreign Law Society and the Transitional Justice and Rule of Law Interest Group for their support of today's program. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Wade Channel of the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Good. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Good to have all of you, and I like this sort of nice intimate setting, so I have a feeling this is going to be a setting that you can interrupt me. I'll let each of my co-panelists, I'll let you know if they feel interruptible. In my family, if you didn't interrupt, you never got to speak, so I'm okay with that. It's fun to be here. It's a pleasure to be here for a couple of reasons. One, Laura and I have worked in various fashions over the years, and it's always just a pleasure to work with Art Omar. I haven't met Anthony, although I've seen his name for years, and I'm finally getting to do that, so I'm very pleased to be a part of this panel. The topic is interesting because essentially what we've done is framed a problem in terms of the MDGs. And the problem is simply well, let me say this first, very important. I work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and these opinions are my own and do not necessarily represent the opinions of the U.S. government, the U.S. Agency for International Development, or my mother.
Well practiced.
Yes. What's that?
Could it represent your father?
Deceased. It's okay. Yeah. I say that because I find openness much more interesting than formal positions. I don't go to events that are about formal positions because to me it's generally a waste of time. You can read those. If you want a good presentation, get open and talk. What's the issue with the MDGs and rule of law? The issue is there's no rule of law in the MDGs. The MDGs are all symptoms of deeper problems, and the deeper problems are not addressed by the MDGs. The MDGs, for the most part, could be characterized very, very accurately as the result of poor governance, of the failure of rule of law, of the lack of appropriate relationships within society, promoting justice in various ways. And all of these are important, and I'm for them. Eradicate poverty, extreme poverty and hunger, number one. I would venture, based on a lot of different sources and reading, that the number one cause of poverty in today's world, not 300 years ago when everyone was poor, even the wealthy were poor. They may have had a little more than those who were dying more brutally and more savagely than the rest, but today we have a major variance. And if you look at any indicators of poverty, any indicators of social breakdown, etc., and you compare, you look at the top and you have the better governed states, you look at the bottom, you have the worst governed states, period. We know correlation does not mean causation, except when it does. And there is strong causative evidence that bad governance leads to poverty, leads to less ability to treat disease, that leads to lack of education when there's a deliberate governmental choice not to invest in education, and the lack of education is not a failure of donors or someone else, it's a failure of the society that's been structured in an extractive form. And I would refer you to two excellent books on this in the last couple of years. One is Douglas North's Violence and Social Orders, which is outstanding. It's 250 pages, reads like it's 500 because it is in fact an economic history. And the other is Acemoglu and Robinson's Why Nations Fail that came out this year, early this year. And both of those essentially look at the fact that when you find a difference, a continuum of extractive to open societies, open access, limited access, privilege to right. In most of the countries where you see the more telling problems, you are looking at privileged societies where the economic and political institutions over the centuries have been defined in certain ways that aggregate most of the power and benefits into the hand of a few and leave the rest out, quite frankly. And it's that period of transformation that we're all seeking to move people not just out of poverty, but out of positive poverty, not just out of poor maternal health, but away from the causes of lack of investment in maternal health, because these things are very good choices. So we like to approach it that way. And from that, I want to give you a little bit from Livingston Armitage, who I had hoped we could make a panelist. It turns out it's 3 a.m. where he lives, and it just didn't really work out to do a video conference at 3 a.m. It's not fair to anyone. But Livingston Armitage has just written a book called Reforming Justice. And the Reforming Justice, he's looking at judicial reform. And he actually puts some of this in terms of the MDGs. I'll read you some comments that are from his book that are worthwhile. And he looks, as I say, he's looking at judicial reform. And his big issue is, as he says, the global reform experience over the past 50 years has been disappointing. For the most part, when you read articles on judicial reform, you see some successes here and there, but most everyone is pretty disappointed. And I think that's not a lot of controversy over that. Where he enters in the area of controversy is, he says the disappointment is due to two major reasons. One is confusion over the goals of reform, and the second is lack of any orthodoxy on how to evaluate the performance. And of course, if you don't know what the goals are, you don't really know whether you've scored. So measuring those goes into the lack of goals. The book's quite good at actually a really outstanding history of development of the past 50 years, as well as a lot of the thinking behind it all. His review of the MDGs provides, as he says, it's a timely opportunity to reframe our approach to the following: that justice is core to development. His big argument, and I find it pretty compelling, is the point of judicial reform, and I would say legal reform and other forms of assistance for change, is justice. And in his mind, and he brings a lot of very good background to this, justice is about equity and fairness primarily. He says that justice is important because it's fundamental to any notion of human well-being and a sustainable society. Revolutions such as the Arab Spring were driven by demands for social justice. Hence, the goal of legal and judicial reform should be to promote justice, not economic growth, good governance, or public safety. However worthy these goals may be, they should not be the goals of governance, of legal or judicial reform. They are outcomes of these reforms. But what is justice? Justice is universally recognized in all cultures as being what we call fairness or equity. Well, without getting into that argument too much, he does save us from having to fight over what justice is and suggests that we've already adopted laws and rules from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is now actually recognized in many countries' legislation, as well as other areas such as those that should be the point of what we're doing. I would like to sort of turn that into a process issue, which is this. I've worked in the rule of law area from the commercial legal side, and my work really got going in 1998 when I was hired essentially to look at why legal reform projects seem to produce so little impact. And over the years, my conclusion has been because they were designed wrong, that there was no way they were going to produce impact because the goals were mixed up. And we were taking a component approach, a chip out of a computer approach, when we were dealing with a living dynamic organism. And trying to put a chip into a living dynamic organism is great for science fiction, but it's not very good for legal reform. And I would put it a little differently, that rule of law is not about laws. In fact, it has almost nothing to do with laws. It's about rule, period. It's about the relationships within society that produce the parameters on our behaviors that either permit or prohibit what we are allowed to do to one another with the resources in various forms and fashions. And the laws that derive from that rule become very important. But if you just put a law into it, you have avoided the underlying questions. And I have had the pleasure of seeing some really great projects where people actually take a relational approach through participation, vetting, and bringing stakeholders who should care into the process. And I've had the displeasure of seeing most legal reform projects to be, at best, badly thought through, at worst, damaging to the rule of law in the countries in which they're held. I've actually seen legal reform projects done in such a way that they have set countries back in legal reform, in rule of law, because they violated all of the principles. They were crammed down approaches where a foreigner gives somebody a law, and then there's pressure put on a president to run it through a dysfunctional parliament, call it law, declare victory, go home, and not even notice that you've just done damage to the very thing that you supposedly were promoting. I'd like to say that's not that frequent, and I certainly haven't done enough research to say it's 70% or 30%. I think it's too frequent if it happens at all, though we have no excuse for that. So part of my desire in doing panels like these is to suggest that there's a better approach, a participatory approach, that actually incorporates the rule of law from that sense of rule, of relationship, before you get to the laws themselves. The laws are really, in many ways, can be the easy part. They may be complex, they may need very high-level specialists to work on them. But the fact is, somebody could give us a law idea right now, and this group could sit here over the next couple of days and probably draft a pretty decent law, whatever it is, just based on our experience and awareness, a little Google research, and maybe downloading a good model law. I don't think anybody would suggest that as a way to go. Well, no, I'm not sure that nobody would suggest that. Something similar has been suggested once, but that would not achieve anything for the countries in which we're working, where the rule is more important than the law, and because the law will be changed or will be agreed to or otherwise based on the rule. And what I've also seen is that when the rule of law concepts are violated in the promotion of new laws, you have no consensus. Consensus is the basis for enforcement, and if there is no consensus, there is no basis for enforcement. And consequently, in many countries, I still hear, I keep hoping it's of the past, but it's not. Oh, we had this really great law passed a couple of years ago. Of course, it's never been implemented. Now, great law, unimplemented, I find a disconnect there. That is not a reform. That's a piece of a reform that was done wrongly, and consequently hasn't achieved much. So I throw that out as sort of a framing issue. We have these Millennium Development Goals, which are about things that we care deeply about. Why are they that way? What are they symptoms of? I would suggest that they're first and foremost symptoms of dysfunctional social, political, economic orders, and that you cannot get rid of these problems without addressing the underlying issues, which is a lot harder. And I think that as lawyers and legal practitioners, legal reform, technical assistance providers, we actually have an opportunity to promote an approach that will get at the heart of the system and not at the symptoms of the system. And if we don't get to the heart of it, the symptoms will just reappear in a new guise later. So that's my intro. I'm only the moderator, not the speaker. So anyway, with that said, yeah, we're okay. And we are going to open this up. We want to talk. We want your input back and forth. And some of you are looking for possibly careers in this field, and we're open to discussing that before the afternoon is over. Andrew?
Thanks, Wade. I don't know, is that the glass half empty or glass half full? But let's just say it was very sobering, your, I think, assessment of where we are. So what I'm going to talk along these lines as well, and really going to talk a little bit about what I call the state of the field, where we are, where we've come in terms of this rule of law promotion effort, and where we're really going, and how things like the MDGs and economic, social, and cultural rights that are related to the Millennium Development Goals and the International Development Framework are sort of related to the rule of law. And I'd like to begin my remarks really by suggesting that this rule of law promotion is really a work in progress. I think we heard some critiques of it just now, but at the same time, I'm of the view that it's actually made considerable headway over the last several decades in terms of both thinking about and also engaging in more effective development assistance, and doing so in a variety of countries and a variety of contexts around the world, in conflict-affected and post-conflict environments. We're undertaking this initiative as well as in fragile countries, lesser developed, and even mature democracies and societies have rule of law needs and are being reformed. So I feel like the glass is more half full, and I'll get into why. And really one reason why is this field, as I said, has been thinking about what we're doing for now about a decade. And I think both the scholars and the practitioners that participate in this rule of law effort have made considerable progress on the conceptual and the definitional issues. And here I would point to the ability that we now have, after frankly not being able to do it, of actually defining what we mean by the rule of law in a somewhat coherent fashion, and in a way that has an operational aspect to it that can be applied in reform and assistance programs. And here I would point you to the definition that has been established or accepted by the United Nations system. It was originally articulated in 2004 by the Secretary General of the UN in his report on rule of law and transitional justice. I have it here. I don't want to read it to you. It is long and somewhat cumbersome, but I do think it is, all the elements of the rule of law are in there, including the processes, the values, and frankly the institutional components that make up this rule of law effort. In addition to the definitional issues, the field has made some headway in identifying and even using some fundamental approaches, guiding principles, and identifying some leading practices for doing this work and for doing it better. This involves, on the front end, still trying to improve how we do information gathering and mapping and needs assessments, and trying to improve the program design methodologies that identify the goals, and then working to improve our performance measurement, and then getting indicators so that we can evaluate the impact of the work that we're doing. In terms of the guiding principles, I would just say that we're trying to take more holistic and integrated approaches. So we're looking at the justice system as a whole, and that when we make a change in one area, that we understand it can have an effect in another. See this a lot in the criminal justice context. Sorry, it's not exactly on point with the MDGs, but if you're working with police to improve the investigation of crime, you're suddenly going to have, and you're working with the prosecutors and the judges are all trained, you're going to have more efficient, more crime, more criminals coming in, but then what about the corrections system? So you got to really think about the big picture, and I think we're starting to do that a little bit better.
Can I jump in just for
Yeah, jump in.
your suggestion about, I'm familiar with the guiding principles in business and human rights. Is there a time there? You're probably talking about different guiding principles, but.
Well, I think the guiding principles that I'm suggesting really flow more out of the international development community, and there's many guiding principles.
Just think about the role that business plays in development, sort of, and that may be a question.
But I'll just tick them off real quick. What I think are some of the guiding principles that we are now really, they reflect, I think, larger best practices and principles of the international development community. and also foreign assistance, but it's just this holistic and integrated approach, making our assistance contextual and responsive, so that we are addressing a need that has been identified for us, frankly, should be in participation or in consultation with the national authorities, both at the government level, but also in civil society, so you have citizen engagement. And we're fashioning responses to address needs and priorities as they are understood and articulated by our counterparts in the host countries. More of that's coming. I think we're doing a better job at that. Trying to develop more comprehensive strategies at the country level, both working with countries to come up with their own strategies for justice, which should include, I think, reference to the Millennium Development Goals and a lot of these economic, social, and cultural rights. How to reform their systems and make their systems more responsive and useful to the citizens in their day-to-day lives. So some countries have these strategies in place. I mean, the challenge is always actually implementing them, as well as implementing the laws that we're putting in place, and then just sort of working with the donor community to tailor our assistance or to coordinate our assistance and make it in sync with these overall strategies. And then using international standards. I think that's another practice that we use. So the hard law, the treaties and the conventions, from beginning with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but then the soft law, so the guiding principles on business and human rights. I think these are things that all of us as practitioners can use to shape, or at least to engage counterparts, to help identify basic norms, and to shape reform both at the national reform and also international assistance efforts. So those are all useful. So sort of all this is in the front end of what I want to talk about, but I want to tee it up in terms of I think we're moving and taking steps in the right direction. Related to that, in this field, I believe rule of law practitioners are better understanding the linkages of the rule of law to other important areas. I mean, we tend to be very siloed in everything that we do, but it's how do we work as rule of law practitioners in other contexts with other people who may be in their own silos. So we're trying to, again, working with scholars and practitioners, figure out those linkages between rule of law and conflict prevention and mitigation on the peace building front, also in what's the role of rule of law in strengthening just democracy and good governance, as well as protecting fundamental rights and freedoms. So I think those linkages are being developed and better understood. So in short, I really believe that where we are, rule of law is being promoted in a much more thoughtful way now, being better planned, and also, frankly, being done with a little bit more rigor. I'm not saying it's where it should be, but I think it's definitely better than where we were 20 years ago, when, I don't want to be paint a caricature too much, but often parachuting in lawyers, judges, police, prosecutors, without too much forethought, and really just sort of hoping they would do some good. We're now, actually, I think we've moved well beyond that, and I'm quite bullish on the state of the field. That being said, I agree with a lot of what Wade was saying, and I think there's considerable room for improvement. And today's discussion, actually, I think is brings on the table one of those topics that should be given much greater exploration and attention. And so, namely, what I'm talking about is how we take these traditional rule of law activities, technical assistance activities, which I would just sort of throw into several categories. First, it's that normative framework. So yes, drafting and making operational and implementing the laws and policies that support the rule of law, and that's a lot of effort on that front, and we're still trying to get that right. So it's normative framework. It's also a lot of activities are aimed at improving the efficiency, the accountability, the effectiveness of the justice system institutions and the actors. So it's the courts, the prosecutorial services, but also the police and the corrections. And then expanding the access to justice. through legal assistance, legal aid, legal clinics, working with paralegals around the world, creating paralegals where they don't exist, and also just the general trying to improve legal literacy, so people's understanding of their rights as well as their responsibilities. So those are some of the areas that I think are traditionally associated with rule of law technical assistance. And so the question is, how do we think of those activities in the context of another important area that I didn't mention earlier? I talked about conflict, I talked about democracy and governance. I'm really now talking about rule of law in the area of strengthening economic growth and development and addressing issues of poverty. And I think we can do that in the context of discussion of MDGs and the Post-2015 International Development Agenda. And it's important because, again, this is where I may be glasses half empty. Many rule of law practitioners, particularly the lawyers, and I think we also have to recognize that there's many others that are working on rule of law issues other than lawyers. Some people think the field's been hijacked by lawyers, and to a certain extent they're right. But it's really, it should be an interdisciplinary effort. But really, they don't teach lawyers much about international development in law school, so lawyers aren't really aware, many of them at first when they get into this field, that they're actually working on international development or in an international development context and dealing with many of the traditional tools of international development. So also, I haven't done my research on this issue, so I invite more information. It's really just an impression of mine based really on I guess, the field that I'm working in. That many of the practitioners and the programs that they're working on in this rule of law field are more oriented toward the political and civil rights issues, and I work mostly on the criminal justice side, so I'm getting a heavy dose of that. I'm not seeing a lot of emphasis, or at least awareness of the linkages between rule of law and the economic, social, and cultural rights among practitioners in the field. I look at some of the recent contracts that come out into the rule of law people, and like the rule of law IQC, I just scanned it the other day. I didn't see any, I saw one brief reference to like economic governance issues. And so these issues are not really being laid out in there. I'm not picking on USAID at all.
No, that's a good point.
If I could, I think even this country is struggling with it right now. I mean, clearly there's a debate about the role of government, and governance here is better than other places, but there's certainly a lot of economic disparity that's grown. So this country's still trying to figure it out, and it's certainly developed.
But yeah, work in progress. I think we have to be aware of that. So, but I do think we're seeing positive trends in this front. And the World Bank is a big exception to what I've been saying. I think they are clearly an example of an organization that's been working and looking at the justice and rule of law issues in the context of economic growth and poverty reduction. There's this legal empowerment movement that is now developing, and they're focusing a lot on these issues as well as the UNDP, the UN Development Program, is contributing to this. I don't know if any of you were at this meeting last week, but the ABA's Rule of Law Initiative, ROLI, actually had a half-day conference on different rule of law issues, and frankly, I was really pleased to see two panels, one on maternal health and the other on youth issues in rule of law. I don't think those topics would have been among the main issues discussed 5 years ago, maybe even 2-3 years ago. So I think we're moving in the right direction. The other thing I would just point to as being positive is it's the declaration of this high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly, which took on rule of law, which took place in September up at UN headquarters. That declaration, which reflects the international consensus, negotiated consensus, clearly links international development or development to rule of law and affirms the essential that rule of law is basically essential to economic growth, sustainable development, and also the eradication of poverty. So that these are all positive developments, as I keep saying, and I think will help us address what's clearly an important need, and that is the fact that, according to some of my basic research, I saw this number quoted by the Open Society Foundation, that some 4 billion people around the world are sort of outside the reach of law, don't have legal identity, and largely because they are poor. And of this amount, saw some other figures that about 1.5 billion people living in conflict affected and fragile countries are also really at the bottom end of the Human Development Index and are the farthest away from achieving the MDG goals. So there's really this lack of legal power that exists in the world, and some people and some research does suggest that this explains why people fall into poverty and sometimes remain there their entire lives. And this lack of legal power it also often results in this marginalization, often results in or impedes people from accessing state benefits to the extent that these benefits are available in many countries, and impedes their ability to receive services such as adequate health care, education, clean water, housing, and it undermines their potential to find employment and develop some sort of livelihoods for themselves and their families. So these people are excluded, they're marginalized, and this phenomenon can give rise to considerable frustration and really put stress on the systems of governance, and it weakens the social contract that exists between members of society and the state. And you made reference to the Arab Spring earlier, and I'm definitely not an expert in that region, but I mean, we can see that the mass movements there, the uprisings there, and perhaps in other countries and societies as well, I've seen them in the former Soviet Union, that one of the driving factors of this phenomena or these mass movements is that people are really fed up and that they're demanding a new social contract with their leaders, with their governments, one that addresses these issues of inequality, injustice, which I think can be put in this justice context, as well as insecurity and their exclusion or their inability to tap into the resources and the economic opportunities that are increasingly thought of as a right. So this is giving rise to all this this instability, and there's the 2011 World Development Report of the World Bank, which really focuses on this issue of conflict, security, and jobs. Brings together all these issues quite well. And in that document, and in other instruments that we're seeing that are being developed to address issues of conflict and fragility. Out of the Busan process, there was this New Deal on the engagement with fragile states, these multilateral agreements. They're all now recognizing the important role of justice in addressing the challenges of governing societies with limited resources. And justice is viewed as one of the elements or the cures to some of these problems, and helping to create that robust social contract between the state and the individual. So in this sense, I've heard of the rule of law referred to as the key to unlock the Millennium Development Goals, to move us forward to achieving them, and then also as a means of improving the human condition. I think it's reflecting Wade's remarks. I agree with this. I've drank the Kool-Aid on it, and as we see in the context of this MDG debate or discussion on where we are and where we're going, there is now this much more emphasis on where should justice and the rule of law fit into this framework. And there's basically two models. One is justice should be in and of itself a goal in the development framework, and that we should be putting in place the targets and the indicators to measure where we are in terms of justice. I'm talking here for the global framework. And then also, again, this issue of justice as the cross-cutting theme. Rule of law is a cross-cutting theme that can be integrated into other development aspects. And I tend to think that's where we're going as a field, in terms of not only where we need to go in terms of just understanding why we do what we do, or how we do, or when we do this work, how we can basically, I think, promote a term that AID uses a lot, I think, human dignity. I think that's also a goal here. But I'm increasingly seeing rule of laws as in this cross-cutting way. I mentioned there wasn't any reference to, but there was a little bit of a reference to the economic growth issues in this large rule of law solicitation. But I also know that in some of the other solicitations that you're probably way more familiar with than me, like this economic growth for poverty reduction, there's clearly in the trade and investment component, the business enabling component, and the other components, there's always laws. We need to draft laws, put in the regulatory frameworks. So I think on that side of the field, you guys get it, the role of laws and institutions. I don't know if the people on the more orthodox rule of law side are really there on understanding the importance of linking their work to your efforts. So I'll stop there, and we can talk. Discussion.
I'll go to Laura, but along the way, I will say, I think I'm more of a glass half full guy, although I'm really more of the glass has been cracked and we're slowly filling up the hole so it's not leaking as badly. Side of things.
Andrew, I'm glad you made that last reference to some of the rule of law work that we're seeing in economic growth programming, because you're looking at a linkage right here. I'm a person that has experience in economics and business and sort of ended up working in legal reform. A little bit accidentally. I had come from working in microfinance. Small enterprise development, was just beginning to work a bit in regulatory reform in Brazil at the state level when the World Bank began doing these subnational doing business studies, and the governors of Brazil were pissed off at the results of this study and were looking at how they could score better, and this dovetailed very well with some of our goals for how small enterprises could export better, such as efficiency of ports and things like that. So I was beginning to work on that, and I was offered an opportunity to go to Morocco to be the chief party for a program that, in a sense, I didn't really have the resume to be the chief party for this program. If this had been in the bidding stage when you submit the proposals, this is what Wade just got back from doing in Uganda, is judging a proposal. My CV wouldn't have been the right one because you needed to have certain, for example, commercial law reform characteristics. But I did have some of the things, including the financial sector work. And I ended up there to kind of rescue a program that was not doing too well, that had not made a lot of progress. And I got hit over the head with USAID, nervous, saying, get some things done, get some laws passed now. And I got handed what I'll call sort of like a dead letter proposal. So this was a proposal for a new bankruptcy law for Morocco. Well, no, it wasn't a new, it was reform to the bankruptcy law. And if you look back in history, how did they get their current bankruptcy law? It was cut and pasted in 48 hours from the French bankruptcy law, because the king wanted a reform done, and there were a number of things that had to get done under this reform, and whatever bankruptcy, Livre le 5, Book 5, got done at the end and got sort of thrown together. And it was unimplementable. And it was unimplementable partly because there were no accompanying regulations, and it had more to do actually with what happened after you got through the judicial process and when you were in the reorganization legalization process and what were the trustees supposed to do. But, you know, at the time, none of this was clear to me at all. And I was basically handed a document that had, you know, articles. And not being a lawyer, had articles, and I was given a professor who was a very distinguished professor of commercial law in Morocco, who had been working on this for about a year and a half, and sort of rewriting this report and continually submitting it to USAID with different sort of commas and changes in these proposed articles. And, you know, where was this going? And so you look back in history again, what did you have? You had an American expert who had come for a couple of weeks and written a report that said, you know, that essentially put in some principles of Chapter 11, you know, U.S. bankruptcy law, and said, you know, here's what you need to do. Well, clearly, you know, it's very different, the U.S. and the French approaches to a lot of issues, to commercial law in general. So all of this was like unwinding for me, you know, a long story, and so we did make progress on this. So I'm going to tell you that story, and then if we have time, I have sort of another little story from a program in Somaliland where we also got into working on legal reform issues through the economic development route. But I did want to step back and make a comment about the Millennium Development Goals. So I was at dinner last night telling my husband about this, you know, lunchtime presentation. He says, oh yeah, he runs a nonprofit that works on youth employment issues. He says, yeah, I'm talking to somebody about getting youth employment into the Millennium Development Goals. So it turns out everybody and their brother wants something in the Millennium Development Goals. So if I were the gatekeeper at the UN for the Millennium Development Goals, one of my questions would certainly be, well, what's your indicator? And is this measurable? And, you know, you do look at some of the things that they've come up with, for example, in the drinking water, where they're just measuring, do you have water to drink? And it's a proxy for something that's much deeper, and obviously they can't do water quality tests all around the world. And you look a little. I went last night and started looking at, you know, the indicators in the governance area and the rule of law area. I found a whole framework developed by the UN for security and justice, which looks at police, looks at judicial, looks at, you know, all of these different areas, and then has a whole chapter on how you need to mount an entire bureaucracy to apply these indicators. Forget about the fact that the bureaucracy that's supposed to operate these issues isn't really functioning. So I got concerned that there wouldn't really be any simple indicators that we could propose. And I just wanted to throw something out there. I don't know if any of you have heard of this book or read it. I grabbed it a couple of summers ago, actually, in France. It's called I Am Nujoud, Age 10 and Divorced. It's about a child bride in Yemen. And it's this whole story, and she's essentially sold off, you know, by her family to a much older man and abused, and it's a terrible story. It's told from her point of view. And at some point, her aunt tells her, she's in the city for a while, away from this terrible situation. She managed to get a little respite, but their family doesn't want her to, you know, separate from her husband. She's supposed to go back. And her aunt says to her, go to the courthouse and ask for a divorce. And in Yemen, you can do this. So first thing was, you know, do people know, you know, what their rights are? As an underage bride, do you have the right to go request a divorce? Second is, do you know where to go? And the third is, do you know what the process is once you get there? Now, I mean, she was told this by her aunt. This wasn't on the internet. There weren't posters in the street. But it's a start. And she got to the courthouse and she asked for a judge. And she kept getting ignored and she wouldn't leave. I mean, this was her life, right? She was like, I'm not going back to this hell, you know, I gotta stay here. And eventually she, luckily, found a judge who was concerned and sort of dealt with the issue. And she got, and not only that, there was sort of an NGO that got involved to sort of advocate for her rights. And so later there were funds that were raised and she got put in, there was money for her to go to school. And there were a series of child brides who came after her, who went to the courthouse in Sana and asked for a divorce. So if I had to look for indicators rather than developing a complex index and to really convince the people in the MDG committee that we need to have rule of law, I would look for these really simple things which have to do with the implementation and have to do with the information about the rule, as Wade says.
And this was before the Arab Spring, I guess, right?
It was.
Yeah.
Yes.
She's doing really well. There have been some articles about her. She's about 14 now.
Yeah. Really interesting.
I think she was either the first child bride successfully divorced in Yemen, or maybe one of the first divorces in Yemen. I mean, she was like, it was a huge story for Yemen. Yeah. Great story.
Okay, so for the stories I'm going to tell you now, we're going to go back to Morocco and trying to get a law passed, which wasn't ready to be passed at all. But I'm going to give you the punchlines, and maybe you'll sort of look for lessons in this story and in the other story if we have time for it. So, and these are sort of some of these are some of my pet themes, and some of them are things I think that will resonate and that others have talked about. One is the thing about big versus small. So, I hear Andrew talk about a systemic and integrated approach and looking at the whole institution, but I also hear that and I think, okay, but that's going to take 25 years. And I think small, and I think focusing on one issue, on one specific law, on one specific problem, linking it to an economic issue and an interest group that can actually benefit if you can do business in that area. And addressing this problem in a multidisciplinary way, but a much smaller one, and getting it to go somewhere. And once you have that successful cycle of having that happen in a country, and you have maybe some of the mechanisms in that country, in our case, for example, there was an interministerial committee that ended up being kind of a fast track for reform. So once that committee's in place, once that cycle has happened once, you can imagine more coming after and the cycle continuing. So this idea of development is so often about budgets, about big projects, about high-level conversations that people get lost in the big. And so remembering the importance of the small. Another would be process. A little bit, as I think it talks about in the description of this panel, and I think Wade alluded to, the idea of being inclusive. In my experience, what does being inclusive mean in practice? There are a couple of things. You can say, yes, it means broadening a dialogue to a wider group of stakeholders. But what does that mean when you have across from you a bunch of people at the Ministry of Justice and a bunch of high-level businessmen who have themselves no incentive to broaden the dialogue? So they don't even want to attend an event that's larger than whoever they want to invite. So how do you actually do this? And a couple of ways I've found is, one is working with the next generation. Because often the next generation of leadership that is not in leadership positions yet, that is being cultivated by the current leadership to step up, they understand, even if the current leadership doesn't, that their stakeholders have to be broader, that their networks have to be broader, and they tend to be more open to it. And then the second that I found has been really important, and this comes partly, I did it out of necessity for myself, but I found that there were a lot of other people who also didn't understand the technical complexities of the issues that we were working on. So I call it technical demystification. And it's putting together briefs, posters, drawings on how an energy distribution system works, on what is a bankruptcy process, what does it look like in France versus in the US, and kind of diagrams, and getting this, this is done often in sort of awareness raising campaigns and different types of development projects, but it's not often done in the legal world. And I found it's been immensely helpful as well in making the process more inclusive and allowing people to participate and have opinions about things that before were black boxes, that either only the lawyers could talk about because they understood how to draft laws, or the engineers or technicians could talk about, and those two maybe couldn't even talk to each other as much as they needed to. And then last sort of punchline that you might be looking for is, if I was just put in a country and told, tomorrow you can rewrite the law or you can rewrite the regulation, and asked, how are you going to have, which one do you think is going to have more impact, I would rewrite the regulation. How many good laws have we seen? How many good laws have we seen that aren't implemented? Often a good law that's not implemented means there is no regulation, or the regulation isn't understood, or there hasn't been sort of a whole process hasn't taken place around how you implement that regulation. And you can often, there may be problems that you have to go back to in the law over time, but at the end of the day, you can solve a lot at the regulatory level. So back to Morocco. So here we are with this, commercial law reform proposal. We've got the Ministry of Justice. We've inherited, so the program I was running essentially inherited 3 older programs and was supposed to do all of the work that they were all doing. So it was working in regulatory reform, but it was doing that in the sense of sort of IT and web-based systems for the government to give out information on what regulations were, and for investors to be able to submit to get licenses over the internet, right? These people that worked in this component, speaking of components and chips, as Wade mentioned, weren't speaking in the same office, in our very small office, weren't speaking to the people who were running the commercial law reform component. That component was doing judge training. And USAID in Morocco over a number of years had essentially supported kind of a missing arm or an under-resourced area, which was the Continuing Legal Education Institute, And so the idea was just that COE, USA does that. They pay for it, they provide it, and what does USA get out of it? Well, lo and behold, they do it on the topics they think, the Moroccans need to know about, like intellectual property and, things that, where there may be which happens to be not the area where maybe it's most needed if you're looking at continuing legal education and what was most needed. So you had this kind of heritage that was there. So what did we do? Well, first of all, so I had USA breathing down my neck, get the law passed, get things happening, and this was, had to show progress. Luckily, we were able to show progress in some other areas, and so this one took a bit longer because we had to go sit in the hallway of the Ministry of Justice. Because there are two guys who had power in the Ministry of Justice. They didn't like each other, and there was a feud. And then there was the nice guy. He was the donor guy. He's the guy that would see all the donors, and he never had the donors talk to each other. Each donor would come in one by one into his office and talk about their little program and then do their program with him. And they would serve nice tea and coffee and cakes at these programs. And so the Swedes would come in and do like a gender awareness, legal training, and then somebody else would come in and do something, and then we would come in and say, we're going to do our judge training on commercial law, and then the donors would never talk to each other, and that was by design, because, God forbid, the donors tried to sort of boss around the Ministry of Justice. A very, very sweet man who managed that process. But we could, if we're talking about getting reforms passed, it was evident to me clearly that man was that's not how it was going to happen. So there's this, what I'll call the power broker guy that we had to talk to. So we would go and make meetings with him, and he would give us a meeting, and we'd go sit in the hallway, and then, he was busy or he was late. And the first time we got a meeting with this guy, the head of the economic growth team at USA came with us, and he was furious after about 40 minutes or half an hour when, the guy wouldn't see us and he left. I learned to just bring my laptop and just get work done in the hallway until the guy would see us and have some patience, and we had to drink tea with him, and we talked about things, and we understood what were the trainings that he thought might be necessary, and what were his issues with the bankruptcy law. And he did care. He did care about the bankruptcy law. He and his team were actually lacking a lot of information about, why on earth would they take this proposal and just pass it into law? Maybe that was necessary, maybe it wasn't, but they were lacking a lot of information on what their options were, about if they really wanted to look at the issue of the trustees and the reorganization of the companies and the implementation of the law. This was sort of a whole separate issue that hadn't been looked at. So we brought in Install, which is an organization that does this professionally, and had Install present to the people in the Ministry of Justice. Lawyer working for our program put together a comparative law, 2 huge binders, which I almost thought to bring as sort of demonstration, but they're too heavy. In my house, a copy of them. But the binders were sort of the background that this original consultant never brought with him. The original consultant who came and said, here's some amendments, and you need to do Chapter 11. These binders had the model laws for these topics. It had summaries of debates between sort of different systems. It showed, what the sort of civil law French type of system has, what the Anglo-Saxon, and then what are some of the hybrids. And so you could just look through this binder, and the next generation, did our power broker guy read them? I don't think so. But his understudy, the sort of next people in line, he grabbed onto this, he actually read it, he actually started sort of shepherding a legitimate dialogue on these issues. So when we left, a couple years later, when I left Morocco and that project was closed down, we did not have a law passed or a reform passed. We checked a lot of other boxes that USA wanted us to check, so we were sort of successful in terms of, getting the things done that we were supposed to get done. But this one, was one of the ones we were most proud of, despite not having checked the box. There was consensus when we left, and I wrote this down, because I'm still not a commercial bankruptcy law expert. There was consensus on on 3 issues. So there was basically consensus by bankers, by judges, by the Ministry of Justice, by the stakeholders in the country through a series of conferences and discussions on what we agree on and what needs to be done. And the first was a more active role by creditors in the reorganization process. So this is the idea of the bankers getting involved, and the bankers not just getting involved in what the law says, but in actually how this is all going to play out once you have a couple of cases that get implemented. The next was this idea of the regulations for trustees. So it's a huge hole that was kind of exposed, that this had to be built. These regulations had to be drafted, had to be thought about. And then the last one was redesigning the prevention phase. So looking at how do you, and there was a question there about do you want to have special allowances for smaller firms? You know, you look at how some of these legal frameworks were designed, and they were designed for big companies, and they were designed for, you know, multinational, sophisticated companies with lots of assets. And what are you going to do with small, you know, some of these smaller companies that exist in places like Morocco? How are you going to prevent that they get into this situation in the first place as well? So those were sort of, and this was genuine and this was there. I'm actually not up to date with what ended up happening with this reform, but I can tell you that I do still get emails where somebody will say such and such law was passed or such and such regulation was altered, and it's something that we were working on. So I'm you know, confident that this process that was begun is continuing. The second story, and I'll be really quick about it, is from Somaliland. So the project, this is a project that DAI is still implementing. Somaliland is in northwest Somalia. It's claimed its own independence for 20 years, so it does not consider itself a part of Somalia. And it was a very interesting process by which it did that, where it was essentially the private sector during the Civil War that got together and said, we can't have this destruction of assets and this chaos anymore, and we need to have a government, and can you guys be the government, and here's some money. It was sort of voluntary tax paying, you know, to get something started. And to this day, the private sector really runs things in Somaliland. So we were looking at the electricity sector, because you can't have manufacturing in Somaliland because it costs $1.20 per kilowatt hour to have electricity. There's no grid. The only electricity is from diesel generators that are nearby, which may be a guy who owns a hotel who shares the extra electricity with the neighbors. It may be a guy who saw that this works well and who bought some generators and then sells it to the neighbors, but it's essentially not very regulated and not very sophisticated. And we had a consultant come see us from the World Bank. So this consultant had worked on all the big projects, and this is the big and the small, right? All the big projects in Africa, including this thing called the East Africa Power Pool, where you've got Ethiopia and Kenya and others that are going to share power, and what does the regulatory framework need to be, and how do you harmonize this? And she, you know, understood this all, and she walked around Hargeisa with us and looked at the tangle of wires above her head, and she said, let's just grandfather these guys out. She said, this just has nothing to do with sort of the level of sophistication of what eventually, you know, you might need to have. And we kind of all mutinied on her, the project staff. We said, no. We said, let's find a way that, you know, that's fine that your law sort of, that you're drafting. She was there to, you know, help design the law. That's fine that the law, you know, envisions sort of a more sophisticated and a sort of technically correct situation with quality standards and safety standards and all the things that you need. But can we find a way that there are possible joint ventures, and that they're, you know, the local entrepreneurs, who, by the way, are the power brokers in Somaliland. Like, these guys are the guys who went to London to go to school and come back. And these are some of the more solid businesses that you have in this country, which barely has an economy. So is there a way that, you know, and frankly, if you were going to go invest tomorrow in Somaliland, in the energy sector, would you want to team up with one of these local guys, or you want to do it on your own? So we just said, can we make sure that the legal framework is really just allowing for partnerships and for joint ventures, and so that these guys can be a part of whatever upgrading happens? And then we did a whole bunch of work, in addition to the legal work, on what I call the technical demystification of sharing very useful tools and documents and spreadsheets with these entrepreneurs about, well, wind could be viable given the high price of electricity, and here's, you know, here are the steps that you might want to take to develop a wind project, and here are, you know, some ways to calculate whether you're going to upgrade your system and how much it will cost, and all of these types of things, so that these were the potential opponents to the new law, in a sense, at the beginning. At the beginning, if you were going to say the Ministry of, you know, Mines and Energy is going to come and regulate, you know, the price that you're charging, and, you know, your safety standards, they're going to say, get out of here, just, you know, don't let that go through Parliament. But eventually, these actors actually became sort of part of the proponents of the law, because they saw that the law was meant to, you know, help advance business in this area, and the economy of their country. So that is still in progress right now. I know that there is a law and there are regulations and they're going through Parliament, but I also know that all of this work on the investment side is continuing. So, yeah. So those are two stories.
I want to open it up. It'd be easy for me to start talking now and keep going until everybody had left, which could be hours from now. But I will point, I really like these stories in light of your presentation as well, this issue of the large versus the small, but I think it's more the issue of understanding the structure and what's going on. I will point out, I don't know if any of you have thought about this. Do you know how long in the US it normally takes to pass a law in Congress?
Years.
Years is correct. 5 to 7
Decades.
on average after extremely experienced, intelligent people have drafted a first draft. And they may have spent a long time on that. Once a draft starts, we're 5 to 7 years. Holland is about 12 years. I think they start the participation process in kindergarten or something. But everyone in Holland has a say in this. Of course, they're smaller to get away. States may be a little
I was
smaller.
a congressional staffer, and when I started in 2001, right after 9/11, one of my first meetings was with then Minority Leader Gephardt on comprehensive immigration reform. And I was an immigration staffer for 5 years, and you see where we are now,
Yeah.
having the same debates on the same issues, but at least it's moving forward. But an example of over a decade, and Gephardt, that was not Gephardt's first meeting on that issue. It had been happening for some time on the Hill, that they were talking about the same concepts. And so, of course, with healthcare, it was decades that those concepts had been discussed. But
Yeah.
finally, when the politics come together,
True.
a lot of work.
Yeah.
Oh, just want to make 2 comments and then an interrelated question. Thank you very much. This is extremely worthwhile. I'm glad it was able to break away and not break back my job. A couple of takeaways for me that I've kind of thought about before is the intersection of law and economics. And I have backgrounds in both economics for law more recently, with recently being sworn in. Also the focus on regulations, that importance. It's not just about the law, but then the implementing regulations and how that goes forward. I like the stories and the country examples. A couple that I was thinking of even earlier on, just because they've gotten a lot of buzz. One is Haiti, and sort of your perspective on that. And then also in this whole post-conflict notion and this 10-year anniversary, Iraq. And maybe that could be a whole other conversation, and without trying to get too much into the politics of these things, but sort of your perspectives maybe on those 2 examples, in light of what we've been talking about.
I would rather make Iraq another discussion. 3 comments on Haiti. I haven't worked there. I've read somewhat on Haiti. I don't know if you.
I've worked there,
Okay.
not in this particular area.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to note in Haiti is what is the socioeconomic or the political economy of the country, and that the power is held by fewer people than you could fill a bus with, and they have held the power. They continue to hold the power. It is not a broad-based economic approach. It is an extractive, privilege-based system, and there are only a couple ways you get into a privilege-based system. You can be born into it, which means your family. If it's ideological, you could be a part of the membership, or you can purchase some aspect of the privilege. We call that bribery. They call that the way things have always worked. They have some historical issues that are understandable, but upon independence, they took a legal route that condemned them to perpetual problems in terms of trying to protect themselves, understandably, from the slavery they had been in. They shut out the rest of the world and became ingrown in a way that has not helped them, and has, from land laws to investment laws to other things, an understandable fear that wasn't well met in the way they approached the fear, and they've had just a really unhappy history. The first of the islands, actually the second.
In the Americas.
Yeah, in the Americas, the second independent nation in the Americas, and the most problematic, perhaps. In many ways, they've had a lot of problems. But if you look at the problems of governance and so on, I often talk about regulation. I'm a big proponent of the World Bank's Doing Business project. If you know it, you may know it as the project that everybody loves to hate and hates to love, because it uses all these proxies for business regulation. And there are issues with the indicators and all of that, but it looks at how well an economy is regulated. And it's not, as some have accused it of being anti-regulation, and that's not the case. It's about better regulation, appropriate regulation, and Haiti is always my example, because of those who died in the earthquake a couple of years ago, most died due to poor regulation, period. It was a failure to regulate in a known earthquake zone, building codes that could withstand a reasonable shock. And it's known shocks because there are earthquakes, there are tremors constantly throughout the Caribbean. If you're over 2 weeks in the Caribbean and don't feel a tremor, you've hit an interesting time in some of these islands. I found that out in Jamaica, much to my surprise, but nobody seemed to be much, everybody was very nonplussed about the building shaking. Oh yeah, it's nothing. We have it. Well, that was no. And those buildings pancaked because of either lack of regulation or lack of enforcement of regulation, both of which were failures of government.
So I came back to your premise before, this being a poor governance system, I guess.
And in this case, it's a privilege-based, once again, a privilege-based system, and those are tend to be the most corrupted in our sense. There's this is the, we're more people down here.
Can I ask something?
Sure.
I don't know if it's
You were
exactly
too
a
late.
question, but as Andrew was talking in particular, I was thinking about, these big ideas of the MDGs, the rule of law concepts and how they help structure government or not structure government, and then all the way down to, we use sort of the Arab Spring as an example. I think we're a brief mention of an example where you see a bit of that social eruption and pushback against the lack of rule of law, or laws that are shifting, need to be shifting because they've been too restrictive or stringent. I wanted to know what your thoughts are on incidents of violence and brutality, because I see them in a similar way. The rape of the woman in India, who was so savagely killed. There's situations like that in the DRC all the time. There's even the rape of the girl in Ohio recently, which is in a way apples and oranges, but I found it interesting looking at the reporting this week that so many in the town, so many reporters mentioned how economically depressed the town was. I was thinking, what does that have to do with her being raped? Right? But there was a lot of talk about this is a poor town, people have lost jobs, and as well as the support of the football team as sort of their one great hope. And then similarly, so there's that kind of construct, like what does economics and the rule of law and our social norms, how does that fit into allowing attacks of brutality, such as violence against women, attacks like that one. And then similarly in India, where some of the reporting talked about this woman being a university student. She is in her 20s but not married. We're in a society where many people are forced to marry even as children, especially girls. She is going to a movie, which many people in India can't afford. She is getting on a bus with her boyfriend when she's not married. And then she becomes subject to this attack that I think they've now said is organized by the bus driver, who knows how many times he had done this before or whatever. And I just wonder what you think about these concepts, as we look at the MDGs and what they're calling for, and as we look at how rule of law is going to go forward maybe in the 10 years or 20 years going forward. How do those concepts, as we've talked about, filter down into specific examples like that? Do you think that these issues are playing out in not just sort of the uprising of the Arab Spring, but an attack on an individual person?
Well, I'm not a social scientist or an economist, but I'm not trying to dodge a question, but I think what your question reflects is that this is very complex, what we're ultimately trying to do here, and it requires all sorts of tools. We're trying to change behavior anyway, and norms. Some of what you said here, is law, or passing a law the way to do that, or it's this interrelationship between society's values and the law, so that those values should be reflected in the law. It reinforces them, but to an extent that they're positive values. And how do you create laws that deal with sort of the negative aspects of our societies and counteract that, and promote gender equality or just non-discrimination across the board. Those are the things that come to mind, and the challenges that we face. And then just sort of this notion of human security, which some of you may be working on and know better than I do, but having this sort of citizen or individual-centered notion of what we're doing and providing security for people individually, and then just generally creating secure environments that allow development to move forward. It's no secret that one of the major threats to development is conflict and violence.
Any comments?
The one comment I would make, and I'm gonna take the gender element out of it because it's not that it's not important, but I almost don't know how to address it. But if you talk about violence, and I'm gonna talk about Libya, I was in Libya actually the week before the tragic events, and it was really interesting because you had donors who were all programming money for post-conflict type of activities, or conflict type of activities even still, working with human rights groups, nonprofits, youth groups, right? These kind of soft projects. And I visited the free trade zone at Misrata, which was the city that was sort of most destroyed, but also the city that has been known as kind of the economic center. And only 40% of the capacity in that free trade zone was being used. And the Libyans in general, and at all levels, really wanted and still want, to get investment into the country, and especially investment that's not around oil. And they're not having success for various reasons. But when you look at, to me, it's about the reason that I guess I would say that I believe in the economic development projects I've worked on is because it's about the energy in the community, right? You imagine, this wasn't happening, but you imagine that free trade zone filling up and the bustling activity in that city is going to be more focused on those economic opportunities than what currently is right now. You still have some kind of factions that are in the nearby city and some tensions, breakaways and old Gaddafi loyalists, and you still have things going on there that are conducive to conflict. So to me, it's sometimes I think in a post-conflict situation, donors need to wake up sooner to the economic potential and move away from the humanitarian. And our project in Somaliland was the same thing. It was the first non-humanitarian project that was there. And the first thing that happened was people showed up in the office and said, what do you need to give us? And they were expecting that these projects were like a lot of other projects that were either giving donations for building government buildings or that were distributing food or whatever it was they were doing. And so it took a while to actually convince some of these people that, no, this is to work with the private sector, to work with business. But then they said, oh, okay, we have that. There are businesses. And so it evolved. So,
Yeah, and those opportunities then can create, almost distractions to some extent.
yes,
They
it
can
is
reshape
how your
the
energy is
social
being channeled.
and
And what are the youth of the country doing?
Right.
Yeah.
Paul Collier's done a bit of work. His book, Wars, Votes, and Guns, I think it play off of the Jared Diamond, Gun, Drugs, and Steel. He looks at the relationship between economic levels of economy and violence and finds very high levels as you go lower. It's more observational. It's not really very explanatory. It doesn't tell you what to do. But you have it. But I will note one area that I ran into years ago talking in Bulgaria to people on the enforcement of contracts. And before the government began to take that seriously after the post-Soviet breakup and the Iron Curtain fell in Bulgaria and others adopted a market economy, you couldn't enforce a contract through the courts. So what happened? Well, those with decent money exposed in their contracts started hiring, as they call them, wrestlers, ex-athletes or thugs, to go break people's knees and,
Sasha and Yvonne.
Yeah, beat them up. The failure of rule of law led directly to violence in the economic sphere, as well as, we know when it does break down, it's in many places you see violence. It's interesting, the gender issue, I will put, it really does become a rule of law issue, but it's an ideological one where the world is rethinking what is the difference between men and women, and should they have the same rights? In many countries, many cultures have not yet come to the conclusion that women should be treated in the same way as men. If that comes, rule of law is how you bring that about, as we saw in our own, or continue to see in civil rights in the United States. We had a law passed in the 60s. Didn't do much good for a very long time. Actually, it was the threat of violence in much of the South, and an extreme threat of violence by very well-trained people who had been trained in Vietnam how to use violence extremely well. And whites began to wake up and realize if we don't do something, we're provoking, especially after Martin Luther King's death, provoking our own end, and began to break things apart. Not a model I like to promote, that if we could get people a little more violent, we might see a little law, but it is something that factors indicate that.
I just want to jump in on that question. I'll be very brief. The enforcement of judgment issue that Wade mentioned is an important one in the commercial sphere, but I would put it in a larger issue of just remedies. when individuals do rely on the judicial system and the legal process to resolve a dispute in a commercial sense or a private sense. They want to be able to, they get a judgment, they want to be able to enforce it. You go to court, you want to have a remedy. You want to and if you don't get it, what happens? I mean, you begin to lose faith in these institutions. And in some countries we see that lack of effectiveness of the formal as people moving into the informal, or people already in the informal, more comfortable with that, don't want to move into the formal. So those are just issues. But I would put it in the larger sense of how do we make, in the institutional, the big part, how do we make the institutions function effectively to increase, and this is in the Arab Spring context, in Afghanistan context, Iraq context, post-conflict, how do we make these institutions legitimate and the perception that they're functioning, they're delivering services to the people, whether in education, housing, whatever. It's it's public administration issue anyways.
I saw a hand down there. Two hands.
Thanks, well, we're a small enough group. I was recently at a religious freedom and human rights conference and speaking with a Christian leader in the country of Jordan. We had such an interesting discussion, and he explained how basically if you would like to convert from any religion to Islam, it's about a 5-minute procedure. You go into a government office and they're very happy to make that change for you. But if you would like to change back, that's where it's illegal. And I asked him, but what if someone doesn't believe it and they generally want to change back to their original religion and they don't feel converted in their heart and mind? And he basically said, Natalie, that's such a Western notion, claiming the heart and mind. And so I said, basically you have an entire country which on paper looks to represent this, and so the governments make laws and allocate funds according to what they believe is the correct demography, but people don't believe that way. And it got me thinking, what can we do to change the heart and mind? Because that's what we want to do, whether it's a Western notion or not. We want to not just write a law or retrain a new set of middle-level judges. We want them to live and love and believe in and go out and teach to the rural populations and go back and teach at the law schools to the rising generation of attorneys that rule by everyone is so much better for everybody than rule by a few. And I'm trying to think, how do we do this and are we successful? Do we have these long-term relationships set up? And as I thought about this, I was at the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts, which is a very tiny bit of this judge-to-judge relationship, and it's judicial delegations briefing. And I think I heard that the National Center for State Courts, and then, or maybe the Federal Judicial Center does a little bit of this. It brings in a foreign judge for about a week or so. The judge is able to come to D.C. The judge also kind of shadows the domestic judge, watches trials, even sleeps at their home. They exchange email addresses, and the idea is to set up this long-term discussion rather than, because too many judges are coming to a first world country, wining and dining, having an exciting time in these beautiful European cities, but they're coming back and it hasn't changed them. So I'm just wondering, what are other long-term programs like this doing to change the hearts and minds? And I believe that part of lasting change, unfortunately, it's very small, very micro, and it's expensive, but it's one-to-one exchanging, maintaining that relationship. And is there a rule of law focus in that?
That's a very good question. I will first refer you to a book, Rachel Kleinfeld's Promoting the Rule of Law Abroad. It's in here in the materials that are handed out. Rachel looks at the failure of some of the first generation. She's very gracious and doesn't talk about it as failure. She talks about it as an iterative process of here's what the first generation did and here's what we're doing now, which is a nice way to approach it. I'm more judgmental. Anyway, she looks at this idea of what she calls enmeshment, which I'm still not fond of the word, of creating more long-term relationships in various ways to actually expose people to other possibilities. One of the other things that's taking place, and not hopefully it's turning into long-term, go back to doing business. The Doing Business Project, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. A few? Okay, just a few. It's a look at the life cycle of a business and what it takes to do that, to open a company, to employ workers, to get licenses, to pay taxes, and so on. And it's time, expense, number of procedures, very countable things that can be looked at. And as the World Bank started looking at this, and I could give you a longer history but won't, They, came up with numbers, and then that immediately turned into a ranking. So you have the ease of doing business ranking across the world. One of the things that it did was it opened up discussion that wasn't possible before. Businesses who knew how bad it was, but the government wouldn't listen to them, could hold up the report and say, we told you, and look, we're number 180, we're number 127, and you said this is a worker's paradise. Well, it's not. It's a terrible place. And anyway, it brought the public sector and private sector together to discuss the problems by exposing that the problems were in fact there. Sometimes exposing falsehoods. One was saying one or another. Remarkably, in Croatia, where you had a change, when it came out, I think that the second or third one ranked Croatia below all other Balkan countries, including Albania. If you know Croatia, that's about as offensive a thing as you could possibly say, that they were somehow behind Albania and Serbia. And they issued a formal diplomatic protest against the World Bank for this ranking, which we're still laughing about that. I work with these guys. It's one of the best jokes ever in development history. And then the private sector got hold of the government and said, no, it's true. And they started changing things, and they have been reforming very effectively. They still got some very serious issues, but it began to change the nature of the relationship, and that's what you're talking about.
And you're focused on internal constituencies.
Yes, an internal nature of the relationship. But you did hit something very difficult from the U.S. government side, and not everyone faces this. If there's U.S. government funding, there's no such thing as long-term. No funding goes before 5 years before it has to be. Goes more than that before it has to either be renewed or canceled.
Not even shorter now.
Many of them are shorter, 3+2 options, or if there was a very brief and unhappy period in Pakistan and Afghanistan where it was year-to-year renewable. You can't work on that basis. You have to send people home. You don't know if it's going to be renewed. So your good people quit as soon as possible to get other jobs, because that's what you have to do. But that long-term, you will see long-term relationships far more in the faith-based community, where people go to live permanently. Humanitarian community. Well, humanitarian tends to be crisis-oriented, but other groups that set up, even ILI, International Law Institute, they set up something in Uganda, which is run by a Ugandan, and it's got another name, African Center of Legal Education -ILI. And they're self-supporting, self-funded, and having a very big impact. Most of them involved at the higher levels in the education have been foreign trained as well, so they've incorporated these kinds of things. But you've hit a number of good points there. How do you bring about change? How do you open the opportunities for people to think differently and to consider how to move to a different state? And that's hard. You get into claims of cultural imperialism, supremacy. I think we should all be very sensitive to that. On the other hand, acceptable gang rape of a woman, I think, is a culturally horrible thing, and I don't think anyone should be ashamed of saying that is inferior, that is wrong, and I stand against it. The question is, how do you interpret that, then work that into something else that can help change it?
I personally initially came to the U.S. as an exchange student from Ukraine through the government-sponsored program for the State Department Freedom Support Act program. I was 15 years old. They selected a few students from the former Soviet Union to come and learn the ways of the United States. When I came, it was very different from what I expected. I was young. We learned about the process of how the democracy works and about the importance of human rights, and a lot of things that were very foreign to the mindset of young generation from that union. But it made such an impact on me that when I went back, I wanted to get more involved with those issues, and I did. And then I came back to the U.S. because I wanted to get education from here, more of it. And so I finished university here, and I continued on. This just illustrates the impact that bringing in younger generations can have on hearts and minds. Those programs are powerful, and we had the unions of the students from the former Soviet Union. A lot of them ended up doing some things meaningful for Ukraine and U.S. relations down the road, and there was probably a reason why those kids were selected. We were more like an experiment. I mean, we couldn't even
the unique part of it is that we were discouraged from interacting with our own country people. We were placed in American families and fully immersed, and we were discouraged from even talking to our own parents. We would talk once a month, and we were 15 years old, 16 years old. So it was a bit of a psychological trauma there, right? But that's how the program was designed, and it worked. You know, it worked, and you grow to love both worlds, and you wish well for both of them, and but you do it in a mindset of what you've discovered here, because it's presented to you in such an amazing way. So I've just wanted to answer also maybe hopefully Natalie's question. One of the answers is to bring younger generations. In a lot of countries outside the U.S., the younger generations begin to study law at the age of 12.
Wow.
In Ukraine, Russia.
I'm sorry.
In Ukraine, Russia. No. It's just amazing. In the former Soviet Union republics, the government, the class of government that teaches you the constitution and the laws, a lot of times in a very cynic way by teachers because they don't believe in it themselves, and they'll teach you, but they'll make you very cynical about it. But they start very young, so if you bring those young kids here who are already studying law, and they are already studying at that early age, you will have people with changed hearts and minds who will go back and do things.
I think you're right. I think you mentioned University of Pittsburgh earlier. Colleague there, Ron Brand, runs an LLM program, and it's remarkable when people come and get an LLM here and go back, what that does for their careers, but also for opening up other possibilities. It's something where I think, from a project standpoint, I've worked at USAID. I think there's more that we can do that follows on Natalie's comments of how do we make sure that we create a base for people who come back and are pretty much alone in this experience in many ways. And I would recommend a book if you ever want to understand that feeling, Chinua Achebe's No Longer at Ease. You may be familiar with him, Nigerian author for Things Fall Apart, which is famous, and if you studied sociology, you had to read it. A great book. But No Longer at Ease is the story of a Nigerian who's been sent off to England for education, and he becomes a liberal Democrat. And he comes back for a government job in Nigeria where there are no liberal Democrats. And, everything that he's absorbed is being challenged, and he's no longer at ease because he's not British, and he's no longer Nigerian either, and he doesn't really fit anymore. And in reading that, I saw the need to find a place within our projects and with the social and otherwise to pull people together, to encourage. I actually think if any of you are doing work overseas, one of the greatest gifts you can bring in many places is just to encourage. In the Balkans, the number one emotion is despair among young people, cynicism and despair. It's when you hit it before they're even out of college, it really concerns you, because college is where you get the idealism. And to have a room full of college students is, it doesn't matter. Nothing we've tried is going to work. I think we can play a good role there.
That's a question.
Sure.
Are you aware of any, I don't know if it's a governmental process, or is the U.S. government participating in this dialogue about, perhaps incorporating these ideas into the next round of the MDGs?
I'm not that connected on that. I know internally I've been in some discussions where we would like to see something on governance in there. The fact is you can use the wrong proxy. You can use it as a door opener to do things right. How do you eradicate extreme poverty and hunger? Well, you first ask what causes them to go after that. Many people believe it's a lack of money. The lack of money is just another symptom. And why is there a lack of money? How do you create jobs? I'm not sure where we're going. Are you?
I don't know. I don't follow that, but I would assume yes. I mean, the U.S. does participate in these multilateral fora on the development agendas. I'm referred to Busan, the recent multilateral. I know the U.S. was there. I was just listening to Deputy Administrator Steinberg last week. He was referencing these processes. So I'm thinking they're in. I don't know who, what level, what office, what agency. I've seen AIDs have these things. So, and then if the civil society is, I don't know if you're interested in that side of it, but yes, civil society is definitely, as Lara said, everybody has an issue. Open Society Foundation is pushing the justice as a goal and a cross-cutting theme the International Bar Association is pushing this as well.
I would say within the U.S., we wrestle with various forms. What does it look like, justice? Is that Gini coefficient, evenness of wealth? Well, there's a lot of resistance there because in a very open society, you will have a skew. But in the democracies, that skew tends to create a large middle class, and it's actually, much better. But there's sometimes concern. So there will be a large debate on how you measure whatever is come up with, because Europe and the U.S. and other countries often disagree. We've on some aspects of it that make it hard to get it into a convention. If you can't agree how to measure it, it's not going to get in because somebody's going to be opposed.
May I just add also, I did read something in 2010. I know that President Obama addressed one of these working groups and did say that the U.S. government is pushing for a rule of law as either as an underlying theme or as one of the development goals.
There's only one reference in all of the subsets of the Millennium Development Goals to government. One. I forget which one it's in. I forget where. But it's not anywhere. Well, it's not part of it.
More indirect or very?
No, there's a mention of government or governance.
I mean, those
It might
other
be in the
areas,
last-
is it even an indirect mention or?
Yeah.
No, nothing. I mean, yeah, I think there are a lot of good reasons.
Hi, Emil. Yes, I'm interested in intellectual property law. I'm an international IP practitioner, and I've done work in entrepreneurship, especially in the tech sector. So I'm interested about your comment about how to find opportunities to contribute what I know to the effort. So if you have some suggestions,
All right.
I'm very interested.
A general comment. USDR is really pushing IP these days. Actually, CLDP, Commercial Law Development Program, does a lot on intellectual property, more so than AID that we've written it. General issue, just so you know, if you're interested in the development work, people say, wow, I'd love to be able to work for USAID. I would tell you, you probably wouldn't. Most of what we do is manage other people who are doing the kinds of things you're saying you want to do. And where you find those jobs are places like Blue Law and dozens of other contractors that are the people that we work with when we actually put a project in place in the field. It's going to be with a contractor who can implement it. We're bringing more things in-house, but what we're bringing in-house that contractors used to do is really more design and evaluation. We're never going to actually run the programs. World Bank, I think, hires a little more directly for straight consultancies, and maybe some of the other financial institutions, but most of the U.S. government hiring, and I'm not sure how INL works, some of the justice sections of the Department of Justice that have international work, if they are as consultant oriented. They do.
The International Monetary Fund, their legal department uses their lawyers to go down and work with authorities and help them draft the laws and make sure the laws comply with international standards. But again, you end up with people who with no cultural knowledge whatsoever and understanding, like you said, planting that chip into the living organism.
Yeah.
And these people, a lot of times, they have no experience in working in those countries, and they come and have 5 days to get some things. But the World Bank also has a small boutique law firm, if you'd like to look at that.
Everything's being outsourced. I mean, the U.S. government outsources it to contractors and grantees, and then we, in many ways, outsource to others, and that we find consultants. So there's I tend to tell people there's basically two career paths, two ways to get involved. As a subject matter expert, you go out for short term, yes, a parachute in, but more and more people do have the country skill, the regional skill, as well as the technical skill, but it's definitely a problem. You need the context to do the work. But at the end of the day, the technical skills still matter. You just want to be part of a larger team that can sort of bring it all together. But so a lot of different, on the contracting side, are doing this. So, and then the other one, other than the subject matter expert, this is the more program design and program administration people that understand how the funding works, how to write proposals, and then how to manage the implementation of projects.
It's very helpful. Thank you. I'm a comparative law scholar, so it sounds
Yeah.
like the
Very
subject
important.
matter.
I was going to say that's probably one of the most important skills to have, is just
Yeah.
the comparative law.
Well, it's fascinating, you know, and the cultural context is really important, especially in IP,
Yeah.
where you go to a place where it's communal in nature, the idea of having individual property. You know, I mean, you've got the WTO putting pressure to, you know,
USTR putting
adopt.
on pressure.
Yeah. So,
Interestingly, in a good long-term project, any area of law that's sophisticated will need experts, and most places you go, an outside expert is useful. If they're brought in to plug into a system that's sensitive to what's going on, you bring in how many lawyers actually work on telecoms laws. So you're a few. You bring them in and they help with the telecom law. That works really well. If it's just flying in, writing a law, and flying out, I will understand your desire or temptation to do that, and that you might actually do that. I would be sorry that was all you could get out of it. And I would say leave it very open, and don't leave a draft law. Leave a draft concept paper that looks like a law that people are then expected to discuss. Although Angola didn't want that. They wanted outside experts to come in and draft laws for them so they could force somebody else politically into some corner for them. They actually were very upset when one of our consultants did it the right way, and they didn't want that. They wanted a plug-in draft to try to make it work. It wouldn't have worked.
I do want to just follow on that. It's a point I always make, is what we are doing is highly politicized, or can be.
Yeah.
We're going in and we're, cliche, we're creating winners and losers, or we're affecting the balance. You got to be very careful in how this plays out. You got to be sensitive to the contexts.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming. I know we've already lost some people back to their, 9 to 5. But, and thank you guys very much. And if you guys want to stay after, I think you waits around for a little.